My name is Claire Donovan. I am 32, and for most of my life, I was the daughter expected to settle for less. My sister Emily was handed every privilege while I learned to survive on scraps of attention and borrowed pride. When my grandmother passed, everything changed with a single page of her will. The house I grew up loving, the place that carried her voice and her strength, was left to me alone. My parents said family means sharing. Emily called it her dream home, and together they told me if I didn't hand it over, I would be cut off forever. That was the moment I realized silence could be my sharpest weapon. But what happens when the one you've underestimated refuses to play by your rules? I promise you this story is one you will not forget. Let me take you back to where it began. I still remember the first time I stood in front of that two-story Victorian in Palo Alto with the keys in my pocket. The shutters were painted the same soft blue. My grandmother loved the roses in her garden still blooming, even though she had been gone for months. I had driven past it 100 times since the funeral, but stepping inside as its owner felt entirely different. The familiar scent of cedar floors mixed with the sweetness of apple pie greeted me the moment I opened the door, and I knew this was more than a house. It was the one place in my life where I had been chosen without apology, without conditions. The will had been read only a week earlier. I still remembered the way my father Richard cleared his throat when the lawyer said my name, the way my mother Margaret's mouth tightened, and the disbelief written across Emily's face. Grandma had left the house to me, and only me. No clauses, no sharing, no hidden conditions. Just my name on the document, notarized and final. When I unlocked the door, the familiar scent hit me immediately. It was the smell of cedar floors mixed with the faint sweetness of apple pie. My grandmother had baked one every holiday we spent together. I walked slowly through the hallway, touching the framed photographs that still hung there. She had kept every school picture of mine, even the awkward middle school years where my hair never seemed to cooperate. I doubted my parents had even remembered those existed. The living room was just as I remembered. Shelves lined with novels, her reading chair by the bay window, where sunlight poured in every afternoon, and the old chess set we used to play with when she wanted to teach me patience. I sat down in that chair for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around me. For once it felt like someone had chosen me without apology, without excuses. As I carried my suitcase upstairs, memories rushed back. The summer I painted the window frames with her, the nights I lay awake listening to her hum softly from the kitchen, the mornings she handed me pancakes shaped like hearts. I placed my things on the bed and stared at the quilt she had sewn years ago. Every stitch seemed to say she had known exactly what I would need after she was gone. The lawyer's words echoed in my head. Claire inherits the property in full. Emily had gasped softly, then her eyes darting toward our parents as if they would correct the mistake. But there was no mistake. My grandmother had known the truth about our family all along. She had watched as my parents showered Emily with ballet lessons, art tutors, and study abroad programs, while I was told we could not afford the debate team fee or the field trip to Washington. She had seen how my father brushed off my straight A's in high school, but gushed about Emily's art projects as if they were miracles. I stood at the upstairs window, looking out over the lemon tree in the backyard, the one Grandma planted the year I was born. The fruit hung heavy now, almost ready to pick. That tree had grown alongside me, weathered storms, and bloomed every spring without fail. It felt like a reminder that even when ignored, some things endure. For the first time in my life, I felt something solid under my feet. Not just property, not just a house, but proof that I had been seen, that someone had valued me enough to make sure I had a place of my own. I knew it wouldn't last long. My parents had never taken no as an answer when it came to Emily. They had always found ways to shame me into giving up. When I wanted to celebrate my National Honor Society induction, they skipped it to watch Emily's recital. When I asked them to come to my college graduation, they sent a text instead while hosting a 50-person party when Emily finally finished 2 years late. I carried my coffee mug to the kitchen table the next morning and sat in the spot where Grandma and I had played chess. She always told me never to reveal my next move until it was time. I traced the grain of the wood with my fingers and let myself breathe. The phone on the counter buzzed. My father's name lit up the screen. I let it ring, the sound filling the empty kitchen, knowing exactly what was coming next. The voicemail that followed was exactly what I expected. My father's voice, clipped and sharp, filled the kitchen like he was standing right behind me. "Claire, call us back. We need to talk about the house." The way he said it made it sound less like a request and more like a verdict already decided. I set the phone down and stared at the lemon tree through the window. I had heard this tone my whole life, the one that turned every decision into a test of loyalty. I knew where it was headed. It took me back to when I was 12, begging to join the debate team. The school fee was only $200, but my father shook his head and said we couldn't afford extras. That same week, he brought home a brand new MacBook for Emily, $3,000 out of pocket, because she needed it for her creative pursuits. I never forgot the sting of that moment, the way my mother patted my arm and told me I was strong enough not to need special opportunities. Strong. That was their word for neglected. By the time I hit 16, I had learned to stop asking. When I showed my dad my straight A report card, he glanced for less than a heartbeat before asking if I had seen Emily's art project. It had been selected for a district showcase, and he talked about it for an hour like she had painted the Sistine Chapel. My mother nodded along, her eyes glowing with pride. I sat at the table with my paper in my hand and realized no matter how hard I worked, it would never be enough. Grandma was the only one who noticed. She slipped into my room that night with a slice of pie and whispered that she was proud of me. I remember blurting out the question that had been burning in me for years. Why do they love her more? Grandma held me close, smelling of lavender and flower, and told me the truth I would not understand until much later. They don't love her more, sweetheart. They love themselves more. Emily is what they wish they were. You are who they really are, and that terrifies them. Her words became armor. While Emily floated through college on my parents' dime, changing majors every semester and never working a job, I was clocking hours at the library, tutoring other students to cover rent, and pushing through at San Jose State until I graduated with honors. Boring, maybe; practical, definitely. When I finally received my CPA license, Grandma was the only one who showed up to celebrate. My parents were in Cabo at a beachside party for Emily's engagement to a man she had known for 3 months. That engagement collapsed by spring, of course, but the vacation photos are still on my mother's Facebook. The memories swirled as I listened to the rest of the voicemail. My father's voice softened at the end, pretending concern. Taking care of that property is a big responsibility. Maybe too much for one person. We just want what's best for everyone. I almost laughed. The only time he ever used the word responsibility around me was when he needed me to clean up Emily's messes. That afternoon, my phone lit up again, this time my mother's number. I let it go to voicemail. "Claire, honey, we need to talk. You know family means sharing. Think of your sister. She is starting her life. She needs a proper home. Grandma would want this." My mother's tone was sweet, almost pleading, but I knew better. She was the same woman who forgot my 25th birthday entirely, then posted a photo that same day holding shopping bags with Emily, captioned "Blessed with my baby girl." The next message was Emily's. She sniffled into the phone like she had been crying for hours. "I'm not saying you should just give it to me, Claire, but maybe we could share it. Or you could sell and split the money. I already have an apartment, you don't need a big house." Her voice cracked at the end. "Bradley and I are ready to start our future, but we can't afford a house here. It's not fair that you get one for free." Free. That was the word she used. As if the years I spent working 3 jobs through school and climbing my way into a career meant nothing. As if Grandma's choice was some mistake the family should be allowed to correct. The messages kept coming from dawn until midnight every day for a week. My cousins chimed in, 2 people I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly reminding me that family unity mattered. One aunt texted, "You're the strong one, Claire. Don't let property divide us. Give Emily what she needs." I stared at the screen, wondering where they had all been when I was scraping pennies for textbooks. By Friday, I stopped checking altogether. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the porch as the sun set behind the rooftops, the scent of blooming roses heavy in the air. For the first time since the will was read, I felt the pressure building. Not because I doubted my right to the house, but because I knew my family. They had never accepted boundaries. No was always the start of negotiations. I thought about Grandma again, about the nights she told me to hold steady during our chess games. Never let them see your next move until you are ready. I rubbed my thumb against the stem of the wine glass and wondered how far they would go this time. The phone buzzed again, vibrating against the wooden porch rail. I didn't pick it up. I knew who it was, and I knew what he would say. The message came seconds later. Richard Donovan, either you hand over the house to your sister, or you are no longer part of this family. Your choice. I sat in the fading light, the words burning on the screen, and realized this was only the beginning. The next morning I walked through the house, with a fresh cup of coffee in my hand, trying to see it the way Grandma had seen it. The hardwood floors had scratches from years of family gatherings. The kitchen still held the faint smell of cinnamon and nutmeg from her baking, and the bay window poured in light that made the whole living room glow. I wandered upstairs and paused in the hallway, staring at the old quilt folded neatly at the end of the bed. It was stitched with patience and love, and I felt the weight of her choice in every thread. To anyone else, it might have been a piece of real estate in an overpriced market worth close to $1 million in Palo Alto. To me, it was security, a roof that could not be taken away, a place where I could finally rest after years of hustling to pay rent in a city that never cared if you sank or swam. It meant I could save the $2,500 I poured into a cramped San Jose apartment every month. It meant I could stop worrying about a landlord who ignored the mold creeping through the bathroom ceiling. It meant I could have a home office, a space to breathe, and maybe even start taking on private clients outside my day job. My work at NextGen Media Tech was steady, but the idea of having the freedom to build something of my own had been tugging at me for years. This house was the chance to make that real. I opened the back door and stepped into the yard. The lemon tree swayed in the morning breeze, branches heavy with fruit. Grandma planted it the year I was born, and every season it bloomed, no matter how harsh the winter had been. I picked one and rolled it in my hand, thinking about how she had raised me to understand the value of slow growth, of putting down roots even when no one watered you. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Emily's voice cracked on the voicemail, thick with frustration. I already told Bradley we'd be house shopping. How could you be so cruel? You already have a place. I almost dropped the lemon I was holding. She said it as if my tiny rented apartment was the same as a stable home, as if all those years of patching together rent checks meant nothing. I paced the garden, trying to calm my thoughts when the memory hit me. My 25th birthday. I had woken up that Saturday with hope that maybe, just maybe, my family would do something for me. Instead, the day passed in silence until I saw my mother's post on Facebook. Shopping day with my baby girl, so blessed. She and Emily posed with champagne glasses raised high, Nordstrom bags at their feet. It wasn't even Emily's birthday month. The hurt of that day still lived in me. I had eaten takeout alone, blowing out a candle stuck in a grocery store cupcake. A text from my parents came hours later, almost like an afterthought. Happy birthday, that was all. I set the lemon down on the counter and stared at the worn wood of the kitchen table. That was why this house mattered. Not because it was big or valuable, but because it was mine, chosen for me by the only person who ever celebrated my victories without being asked. Later that evening, I sat at the desk in the front room and ran the numbers out of habit. With no rent, I could save almost $30,000 a year. In 5 years, I could have enough for investments, maybe even open a small accounting firm of my own. It wasn't glamorous, but it was freedom. Emily would never see it that way. For her, the house was a symbol, a backdrop for parties and social media posts, proof that she was still the center of our parents' universe. She didn't care about the mortgage I never had or the time I spent studying by candlelight when the power was cut off in my college apartment because I couldn't pay the bill. She wanted the house because it was easier to want what was already in my hands than to build her own. The phone rang again. This time I answered, tired of the buzzing that had filled my days. My father's voice came through, impatient and certain. "Claire, we talked it over. It's simple. You hand over the house, Emily gets her dream home, and the family stays together." I didn't say a word. He sighed heavily. "Don't be difficult. Think about holidays. Think about future grandchildren. You don't want to throw that away, do you?" I thought about holidays. The ones I spent alone while they were with Emily in Tahoe. The Christmas they skipped when I was 21 because Emily had a ski competition. The Thanksgiving when I cooked a whole meal for Grandma and me while the rest of them flew to New York for Emily's art show. I thought about what family had ever meant in this house, and it was never them. I hung up before he finished. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from the quiet rage of years pressing down at once. That night I walked room to room, touching the walls, whispering to myself that I had earned this. Maybe not in the way Emily measured success, but in the hours, the sacrifices, the quiet strength Grandma had seen all along. I sat at the bay window as the streetlights flickered on outside the quilt, wrapped around my shoulders, and felt a calm determination settle in me. They wanted me to hand it over like it was theirs to claim. But it wasn't theirs, it was mine. I closed my eyes, listening to the faint hum of traffic beyond the neighborhood, and knew they would not stop pushing. This house was the beginning of a battle they thought they could win. The doorbell rang, startling me upright. I froze, heart pounding, before walking slowly down the stairs toward the front door. When I pulled the door open, my parents were standing on the porch, with Emily wedged between them. My mother's lipstick was too bright for the late evening light, her arms folded tightly like she was bracing against the chill. My father's jaw was set, his eyes locked on me with the same look he used when I was a teenager and dared to argue. Emily clutched a tissue and dabbed at her eyes, even though I could tell no tears had actually fallen. "We need to talk," my father said, pushing past me, as if the threshold was his to cross. My mother followed Emily right behind like they owned the place. I closed the door, slowly leaning on it for a moment before turning to face them. The living room looked different with them inside. My father paced his shoes, clicking against the wood floors, while my mother ran her fingers along the bookshelves, as if inspecting for dust. Emily perched on the edge of the sofa, eyes wide, lips trembling. It was a scene straight out of my childhood. The tribunal assembled, me standing alone in the center. "Claire, my mother," began her voice, low and deliberate. "Family is supposed to share. You've always been independent. You don't need this house. Emily does." I crossed my arms, steadying my breath. This house was left to me. Grandma made that decision. My father stopped pacing and turned on me. "Wills can be contested. Don't act like this is settled. You think one piece of paper means anything against family." He jabbed a finger toward Emily. "Your sister is about to start her life. She and Bradley deserve a home to build a future." Emily sniffled on cue. "I don't want to fight, Claire. I just want us all to be happy. You already have an apartment. You don't even need a house this big." My voice came out quieter than I expected. "I do need it. I need a place that's mine without conditions." My mother's eyes hardened. "If you really cared about this family, you would give your sister what she needs. Don't be selfish." I laughed, the sound harsh in the quiet room. Selfish. That was their favorite word for me, the one they used when I asked for anything at all. I remembered being 16 and asking for help with a college prep course. Too expensive, my father had said. A week later, Emily was enrolled in ballet lessons with a private coach. My father took a step closer, lowering his voice like he was giving me one last chance. "If you refuse, you will be cut off completely. No holidays, no family dinners, no place in this family." I felt the words land, but instead of fear, something inside me loosened. It was the same ultimatum he had used a dozen times before when I refused to give Emily money or time I didn't have. The threat of exile only worked on someone who believed they were truly welcome in the first place. Before I could answer, the doorbell rang again. My Aunt Sylvia and her husband Tom stepped inside, summoned as reinforcements. Aunt Sylvia hugged Emily tightly, glaring at me over her shoulder. "Family unity, Claire. That's what matters. Don't let property tear us apart." Tom added his weight, nodding toward my parents. You're strong, Claire. You've always been the strong one. Emily is fragile. She needs this more than you do. Their words pressed against me like a tide. I felt surrounded the same helplessness that had swallowed me at every childhood dinner when the conversation circled around Emily's triumphs. I wanted to scream that I was tired of being strong, tired of being the one expected to survive on scraps while Emily was handed feasts. Instead, I straightened my shoulders and let the silence stretch. My father mistook it for hesitation. He placed his hand firmly on my shoulder, squeezing hard. Good. You're seeing reason. We can get the paperwork started tomorrow. I stepped back, shaking him off. I haven't agreed to anything. Emily's face crumpled into practiced despair. Please, Claire, don't ruin this. Bradley already thinks we're moving in. We've looked at paint colors, furniture. I've told my friends, you can't embarrass me like this. The mention of embarrassment made my stomach twist. That was always the threat. If I didn't bend, I would be the one blamed for shame brought upon the family. I looked around the room at my parents' expectant faces, at my aunt and uncle nodding like they were part of some jury, at Emily, holding her tissue like a prop. The air felt heavy, thick, with decades of manipulation. I wanted to tell them no right then, to shout it until the walls shook. But Grandma's voice whispered back to me, the memory of her hand resting on mine during our quiet chess games. Never let them see your next move until you are ready. I drew a slow breath and let my shoulders slump just enough for them to think I was giving in. My father's eyes gleamed. My mother's lips curved in satisfaction. Emily let out a shaky sigh of relief. Fine, I said softly, my words barely above a whisper. The room brightened with triumph. My aunt patted my hand. My mother pulled Emily into her arms. My father clapped Tom on the back as if the deal was done. They didn't notice that I never actually said yes. I walked to the window and stared at the lemon tree outside, its branches silhouetted against the darkening sky. My family celebrated behind me, convinced they had won. Inside, I felt something else entirely, a calm that settled deeper than their noise could reach. I had played my move, but the game was far from over. The next morning, I woke to silence, the kind that settles in a house after a storm has passed. My parents and Emily had finally left the night before, convinced I would follow through with their demands. I stood in the kitchen, making coffee, watching the steam curl above the mug, and felt the strange calm of knowing they thought they had already won. It was a performance I had perfected since childhood, letting them believe they were steering the wheel while I quietly mapped out my own route. I moved through the house, slowly touching the familiar walls, the cool banister, the polished wood that still smelled faintly of Grandma's lemon oil. They wanted to take it from me to hand it over to Emily, as if my grandmother's will had been nothing more than a suggestion. Instead of fighting openly, I would let them choke on their own certainty. By late afternoon, Emily called, her voice unusually chipper. I told Bradley the good news, Claire. He's thrilled. We're already looking at furniture for the front room. Isn't that exciting? I kept my voice neutral. That's something. She babbled on about color schemes and dinner parties, her words spilling like confetti until I cut her off. I'll let you know when things are ready, she squealed. Thank you, before hanging up. I set the phone down on the table and stared at the wood grain, my jaw tight. She was already celebrating, already planning to parade this house as her prize. That night, as the crickets chirped outside, I pulled out the files Grandma's attorney had given me. The language in the will was airtight. No room for reinterpretation, no loopholes for family override. Still, I knew my parents. They would try to twist it, drag me through courts if they had to. I needed protection beyond ink and signatures. I scrolled through old contacts until one name stopped me cold. Marcus Liu. My chest tightened with the memory of long nights in the university library, sharing stale coffee and whispering formulas to each other before exams. We had lost touch after graduation, but I had followed his rise from afar. He was now CEO of Next Gen Media Tech, the very company where Emily had just been promoted. It felt almost too perfect. My thumb hovered before I typed a simple message. Marcus, this is Claire Donovan. I heard through mutual channels you've been looking for property in Palo Alto. I might have something. The response came almost instantly. Claire, long time, I am very interested. Can we talk? I set the phone down, pulse racing. I didn't know if I was ready to take this step to sell the house even temporarily, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. My family would never see it coming. The next day we met at a quiet cafe off University Avenue. Marcus looked older, sharper, the lines of leadership carved into his face. But when he smiled, it was the same easy grin I remembered. We shook hands, and for a moment, I was back in the library, laughing at his terrible jokes while we crammed for finals. He ordered coffee and leaned in. I heard about the house, Claire. Congratulations. I also heard about the pressure. I stiffened. Word travels fast. He nodded. It does in this town. Your sister works under my marketing division. She has been very vocal about a new home. I swallowed hard. So you already know. He studied me for a moment. I know enough. Tell me what you need. I explained everything. The will, the harassment, the late-night ultimatums, Emily's claims that the house should be hers. I admitted I was tired of being cornered. I wanted control. Marcus listened without interrupting, then pulled a folder from his briefcase. Next Gen is expanding. We need a satellite office for the creative teams. Your house's location is perfect. I can offer $1 million above market. The number made my breath catch. But I want to keep a connection, I said quickly. This house means everything to me. He smiled. We can arrange that. A 10-year lease at a reduced rate. You live upstairs, we take the main level for the office. And one more clause. You have first right to buy back at the original price if I ever sell. I stared at him, stunned by the precision of it all. It sounded less like a business deal and more like the safety net I had been searching for. Do it quietly, I said. They cannot know until it's done. Marcus tapped the table once. Understood. That night I returned to the house and stood on the porch, the cool wood beneath my feet grounding me. For years my parents had treated me like a pawn, useful only when Emily needed something. They believed they had cornered me again, but this time I had moved first. The moonlight spilled across the garden as I whispered to myself that Grandma would approve. She had always told me the best way to win against people who twist your life is not to fight on their terms. It is to change the board entirely. Inside, the phone buzzed with another message from my mother. Family meeting tomorrow. Be ready to sign. I turned the phone face down on the table, the quiet hum of the house wrapping around me, and felt the steady beat of my own resolve. Marcus called early the next morning, his voice steady and professional, as if we had not just reopened an old friendship the night before. Claire, I spoke with my legal team. Everything can be finalized within 48 hours if you are ready. I stood in the kitchen with a piece of toast untouched in my hand, staring at the sunlight streaking across the counter. Ready, I said. Do it. The next 2 days moved like quicksand, slow on the surface, but heavy underneath. Karen Blake, the attorney Marcus brought in, walked me through every document with a precision that made me feel both safe and unsettled. She sat across my dining table, papers spread in neat stacks, her glasses sliding down her nose as she explained the lease terms. 10 years, she said, rent significantly below market. You will retain residence upstairs with full rights to privacy. If the company ever sells, you have first refusal at the same purchase price. I traced the words with my finger, absorbing their weight. It felt less like giving something up and more like sealing a vault. My grandmother's house would never slip into Emily's hands, not now, not ever. When I signed, the pen felt heavier than it should have. Karen nodded, satisfied, and collected the pages. Marcus sent a text within the hour. Funds wired. Congratulations. That night I sat on the porch listening to the neighborhood quiet itself. The contract was done, the ink dry, the county recording scheduled. My parents were at home thinking I was about to fold, that they had bullied me into surrender. Emily was probably scrolling Pinterest for curtains she would never hang. I leaned back against the railing, letting the evening air cool my skin, and felt a strange peace. The following day Marcus invited me to his office in Redwood City. I walked into the glass building, all clean lines and bustling energy, and for a moment felt underdressed in my navy blazer and flats. But Marcus greeted me with the same warmth I remembered from years ago. He ushered me into a conference room with a view of the bay, the skyline sharp against the sky. "This house is more than real estate for us," he explained, pointing to a map of Palo Alto neighborhoods. "We need a creative hub outside the main campus, somewhere that feels residential, grounded. Your grandmother's property is perfect." I swallowed hard. "My sister works for your marketing division. Won't this be awkward?" Marcus leaned back, folding his hands. "Emily is an employee. She will adjust. If she does not, that is her choice." His tone was even, but the message was clear. I left the building with my heart pounding, a folder of glossy architectural sketches tucked under my arm. They were planning to renovate the downstairs into collaborative workspaces, keeping the charm of the Victorian exterior intact. Upstairs would remain untouched. My sanctuary. That evening, my phone buzzed with Emily's name. I ignored it. Then my mother's number lit the screen, then my father's. I let them all go to voicemail. By the time the sun set, I had 12 missed calls. One message from Emily stood out, her voice trembling. "Claire, please don't drag this out. We're family. Just hand it over so we can move forward." I pressed delete without listening to the rest. Karen arrived the next morning with a stamped packet from the county recorder's office. It was official. The house no longer belonged to me. It belonged to Marcus and Next Gen Media Tech. But the lease agreement in my drawer reminded me that in every way that mattered, it was still mine. I walked through the rooms, slowly seeing them with new eyes. The downstairs would soon echo with voices of designers and marketers, with the clicking of keyboards and the hum of printers. Upstairs, my life would go on undisturbed. Two worlds under one roof, stitched together by a contract my parents could never undo. The relief settled into my bones. For the first time since the will was read, I slept without waking at every buzz of my phone. On the third morning, I woke early, brewed a pot of coffee, and carried a cup out to the porch. The lemon tree glistened with dew, the street was quiet, and I felt an odd mixture of triumph and anticipation. My parents still believed they held all the cards. They had no idea the game had already ended. The calm was broken by another vibration of my phone, a message from my father, curt and demanding. "Family meeting at Attorney Mills's office. Tomorrow, be there." I sipped my coffee slowly, watching the sun break over the rooftops, and knew the confrontation I had been waiting for was finally on its way. Attorney Mills's office sat on the third floor of a sandstone building in downtown Palo Alto, its lobby smelling faintly of lemon polish and old carpet. I arrived 10 minutes early, my stomach tight but my face calm. Years of being cornered by my family had taught me how to mask every flicker of doubt. When the elevator doors slid open, I saw them. My father's shoulders were squared, his jaw clenched. My mother held Emily's arm like she was escorting royalty, her lips already tight with disapproval. Emily's makeup was flawless, her eyes rimmed red, as if she had been rehearsing tears in the car. Behind them stood Aunt Sylvia and Uncle Tom, whispering to each other, like they had been summoned as witnesses. "Claire," my mother said coolly, as if she had not sent 20 messages in the last 2 days, "we are here to put this matter to rest." I nodded once and followed them inside the conference room. Attorney Mills rose from her seat at the head of the long mahogany table. She was a woman in her 60s, calm eyes behind steel-framed glasses, her voice steady. "Let us begin." My father wasted no time. "We have our own real estate agent, Mrs. Patterson. She already has buyers lined up, cash in hand. All we need is Claire's signature." The agent, a tall woman in a sharp red blazer, slid a stack of forms across the table toward me with a practiced smile. This property could close within a week. Very hot market. I did not touch the papers. "The will was already settled," I said quietly. "Wills can be challenged," my father shot back. "Mental capacity, undue influence. We have spoken to attorneys." Emily's voice broke as she dabbed at her eyes. "I cannot believe you are making us do this, Claire. After everything our parents have given you." I wanted to laugh at that. Given me. As if years of neglect and indifference had been gifts wrapped in ribbons. Instead, I kept my face neutral the way Grandma had taught me during chess matches at the kitchen table. My mother straightened in her chair. This selfishness has gone far enough. One daughter hoarding a property while the other struggles. Is that the kind of family you want to be remembered as? Mrs. Patterson pushed the documents closer. If you sign today, we can guarantee a higher than average closing price. I glanced at Attorney Mills. She adjusted her glasses, her tone measured. Mrs. Donovan has not agreed to sell. My father leaned forward, his voice dropping into that dangerous register that used to silence me as a child. She will. Because if she does not, she is finished with this family. No holidays, no grandchildren, no seat at this table ever again. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For a moment, even Aunt Sylvia looked uneasy. My mother reached across to squeeze Emily's hand. Your sister needs this house, Claire. Her new position requires her to entertain clients, to host gatherings. She cannot do that in a rented apartment. I looked at each of their faces, so confident, so sure they had me pinned. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the vibration against my leg like a secret reminder. I had not forgotten Marcus's message the night before. Everything is signed. Ready when you are. I folded my hands on the table. Perhaps you should all see what you are so desperate to claim. My father narrowed his eyes. What game are you playing? No game, I said evenly. If this is going to be settled, it should be settled at the house. My mother stood quickly, her purse already in hand. Good. Then we can end this today. The room broke into murmurs as chairs scraped back. My father strode ahead with the agent Emily, clutching tissues dramatically at his side, Aunt Sylvia, whispering furiously to Uncle Tom about fairness and loyalty. Attorney Mills gathered her files with a sigh, clearly uneasy but unwilling to abandon her client. As we filed into the elevator, my father turned to me, his voice thick with triumph. You are doing the right thing. I said nothing, keeping my eyes on the glowing numbers above the door. The convoy of cars wound through Palo Alto like a funeral procession. I drove alone, my family's SUV close behind Mrs. Patterson's glossy sedan following them. Attorney Mills's Lexus trailed at the end, her expression tight in the rearview mirror when I glanced back. When I turned onto Maple Street, the house came into view, its white trim bright against the afternoon Sunday. My grandmother's garden was in bloom, roses spilling across the fence line. I pulled into the driveway slowly, my pulse steady despite the weight of what was about to happen. In the rearview mirror, I saw Emily's face pressed close to the glass eyes, wide lips moving as she spoke to my mother. My father's expression was set in stone, his jaw tight with victory. I parked and stepped out, the air sharp with the scent of lemon blossoms. My family gathered on the sidewalk, their voices low, their excitement barely concealed. Let's go inside, I said, unlocking the front gate. My father adjusted his jacket, already striding ahead. Finally, I walked toward the porch, the key cool in my hand, and paused just long enough to take in their eager faces. My heart beat steady as I reached for the door. The hinges groaned softly as the front door swung open and the sound of voices drifted out from the living room. My family froze behind me, their faces shifting from triumph to confusion. A man's voice, deep and calm, carried through the hall. Marcus Liu stepped into view, tall in a tailored gray suit, a folder tucked under his arm, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "Hello, Claire," he said smoothly, before turning his eyes toward the group clustered at the doorway. "And you must be the family." Emily's hand flew to her mouth, her tissue crumpling. My father's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. My mother blinked rapidly as though her brain needed time to process what she was seeing. Aunt Sylvia muttered something under her breath that sounded like a prayer. "What is going on here?" my father demanded, pushing past me. "Who are you?" Marcus extended his hand, politely unbothered by the sharpness in my father's tone. "Marcus Liu, CEO of Next Gen Media Tech." Emily gasped as though the ground had shifted under her. She knew that name. Everyone in her division at the company did. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Marcus glanced at me with the faintest smile before addressing the group. I believe you are here regarding this property. Perhaps we should clear things up. My father's face reddened. This is my daughter's house. We are here to finalize the sale. Actually, Marcus, said his voice firm but calm, this property belongs to me and my company. Claire completed the sale last week. We have already filed with the county. Everything is legally binding. The silence that followed was thick and absolute. Emily's knees seemed to give way and she collapsed back against the sofa. My mother's hand shot out to steady her, but her own fingers trembled. Aunt Sylvia and Uncle Tom exchanged panicked looks, their mouths opening and closing like fish. That's impossible, my father barked. You can't just buy it behind our backs. I finally stepped forward, my voice clear. I could and I did. The will was clear, the choice was mine. You told me I had to hand it over or lose this family. I decided I don't need to hand it over and I don't need to lose anything except the weight you've been putting on me my entire life. Emily's face turned blotchy with rage. You can't do this to me, Claire. Do you know how humiliated I'll be at work? Everyone knows I was moving in. Bradley's parents already congratulated us. Marcus's gaze flicked to her, calm and unflinching. Miss Donovan, you should be aware that discussing personal family matters so publicly in the office has not gone unnoticed. There have been concerns about professionalism. Her mouth fell open, her eyes darting to my parents for rescue. But they were too busy staring at Marcus, their power dissolving in real time. My father's voice cracked with fury. You've made a fool of us, Claire. You've embarrassed this family. I felt something shift inside me, not guilt but release. For years I had carried the burden of being the strong one, the quiet one, the one who absorbed every blow without complaint. And now finally, I had put the weight back where it belonged. This house was never yours to claim, I said quietly. Grandma left it to me because she saw the truth. She saw who I was, who you made me into by ignoring me. You taught me to fight for myself, and that's exactly what I've done. The neighbors had begun to gather outside, drawn by the raised voices, and the row of cars parked along Maple Street. I caught sight of Mrs. Henderson from across the road arms, folded her eyes sharp as she whispered to another neighbor. My family's shame was no longer confined within walls. It spilled out onto the street, into the eyes of people they had spent years trying to impress. Emily let out a strangled sob. You've ruined everything. Marcus closed the folder in his hand. No, Miss Donovan. Claire has simply chosen not to let you ruin her. My mother's face was pale, her lipstick too bright against the tightness of her mouth. She pulled Emily close, whispering something frantic while my father's hands shook as he reached for the papers Marcus had brought. His eyes darted over the signatures, the seals, the county stamps, and each mark seemed to cut deeper into his pride. This isn't over, he hissed at me. I met his glare with calm eyes. It already island. The room fell silent again, save for the faint hum of traffic outside. Aunt Sylvia cleared her throat, her voice weak. Maybe it's best if we go. Tom nodded quickly, eager to retreat. Emily's sobs grew louder, echoing off the walls, as if trying to drown out the truth. My mother gathered her purse, her face stiff with humiliation. My father lingered for one last glare, before shoving the door open and marching out. The sound of their footsteps faded down the porch, the murmurs of the neighbors rising in their place. I stood in the center of the living room, the quilt still draped over the arm of Grandma's chair, and felt a wave of quiet strength wash over me. Marcus slipped the folder back into his briefcase and gave me a nod. They will calm down eventually. But you need to be ready for more pushback. I exhaled slowly, my eyes drifting to the lemon tree outside the window, glowing golden in the late afternoon light. For now, the worst was done. The quiet returned, settling deep into the bones of the house, and I let it hold me steady, for the next storm I knew was still on its way. The first email came less than 24 hours later, a thinly veiled threat from a lawyer my parents had clearly scrambled to find. Words like undue influence and contesting the will stared back at me from the screen. My hands trembled, but not from fear. It was anger, sharp and familiar, rising from a place I had carried since childhood. I forwarded the message to Attorney Perez, who had been by my side since the reading of Grandma's will. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. "Claire, don't worry," she said firmly. "They have no grounds. Your grandmother's estate planning was airtight. She had 2 medical evaluations before signing, both confirming she was of sound mind. This is noise, nothing more." Still, it rattled me. The thought of being dragged through court headlines in the local paper, neighbors whispering. But then I remembered the look on Emily's face when Marcus had stepped into the living room. That memory steadied me like a hand on my shoulder. By the end of the week, the family group chat lit up like a bonfire. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years chimed in about loyalty, and bloodlines parroting my mother's words. Uncle Rick declared I was spitting on family tradition. Aunt Sylvia accused me of orchestrating this sale just to humiliate Emily. Each ping on my phone felt like a stone thrown at glass, but I refused to respond. Silence, I decided, was the sharpest reply. The next storm rolled in at work. I walked into the accounting office Monday morning to find 2 of my coworkers staring at their phones, whispering. My stomach tightened as I set down my bag. Was it already spreading the news, the drama? Sure enough, by lunch, Emily's meltdown had made its way into the office rumor mill. She had apparently told anyone who would listen that I had schemed to destroy her career. In the break room, my colleague Dana leaned over and whispered, "Did you really sell the house to Marcus Liu?" I paused, pouring coffee slowly, watching the dark liquid swirl. "Yes," I said simply. Her eyebrows shot up. "That's wild. People are saying Emily's department might get shaken up because of it." I shrugged, keeping my face calm. Work was work. My personal life had no place there, but deep inside I couldn't help but register the irony. For once, it was Emily's reputation unraveling, not mine. The neighbors, on the other hand, treated me like a hero. Mrs. Henderson stopped me on my walk one evening. "Eleanor would be proud," she said, patting my arm. "You did what none of us ever thought you'd do. You stood up to them." Her words carried me through the nights when doubt tried to creep in. Because doubt still came, usually when the house was too quiet and my phone lit up with another string of messages from my mother. The tone swung wildly from guilt-tripping to rage. "Family means sharing. How could you do this to your sister? You've chosen greed over love." Each message chipped away, but I read them all, reminding myself that this was exactly why Grandma had been so precise in her will. She knew they would try this. She knew I would need the protection of her foresight. The following week brought a different kind of confrontation. Emily showed up outside the house on a Wednesday evening just as I was watering the garden. She stood at the edge of the driveway, arms crossed, eyes rimmed red. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she spat. "Watching me suffer, watching me get torn apart at work." I turned off the hose and set it down. I didn't answer right away. The truth was complicated. I didn't enjoy her suffering, but I did feel a grim satisfaction that for once she was being held accountable. Emily stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Marcus has put me on notice. He says if I don't separate personal issues from work, my position is at risk." "Do you understand what that means?" I looked at her. Really looked at her. The expensive shoes, the designer purse, the trembling lip. All the things she had been handed for years now slipping through her fingers. "Yes, Emily," I said. "It means you have to stand on your own 2 feet the way I always had to." Her face twisted with fury. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" "No," I said quietly. "I just think I finally stopped being less." She stormed off, then tires screeching as she pulled away. I stood in the driveway long after the sound faded, the cool evening air wrapping around me. A few days later, Attorney Perez called with good news. The court had dismissed my parents' initial petition before it even reached a hearing. Their claims of undue influence were baseless. Relief coursed through me, but it was tempered with reality. They weren't going to stop. They never had before. Sure enough, the next blow came through social media. My mother had posted a long, dramatic message about betrayal and selfish daughters, painting me as a cold-hearted woman who had abandoned her family. By the end of the day, the post had hundreds of comments, mostly from distant relatives, and her church friends, many of whom I had never met. I read every word, letting the venom sink in then close over, like a healed scar. For every angry comment, there was another message waiting quietly in my inbox. From women I barely knew, from neighbors, from coworkers' mothers. Notes that said things like, "I went through the same thing," or "Thank you for standing up for yourself." The solidarity of strangers gave me more strength than the approval of my own blood ever had. By the end of the month, the house had settled into its new rhythm. The downstairs buzzed with the slow transformation Marcus had begun, preparing the space for the creative hub he envisioned. The upstairs remained mine, filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of pages turning late at night. But beneath it all, I knew the tension hadn't broken. My parents were too proud to retreat quietly. Emily was too desperate to let her image crack any further. The silence from their side wasn't peace. It was plotting. One evening, as I locked up the front door, I spotted Aunt Sylvia's car idling down the block. She pretended to be checking her phone, but I knew she was watching. The message was clear. They weren't done circling. I closed the door behind me, the familiar scent of Grandma's lavender still lingering in the walls, and braced myself. The next chapter of their war was coming, and this time it would be public. It started with the knock on my office door at work. Dana leaned in, eyes wide, holding her phone like it was hot. "Claire, did you see this?" I shook my head, and she handed me the screen. There it was, a headline on the local paper's website. "Family feud over historic Maplewood home goes viral." And right below it, a picture of me standing on the front porch, arms crossed, with Marcus Liu in the background. My stomach dropped. The photo had clearly been taken by one of the neighbors that day, when everyone gathered to watch. I scrolled down. The article was filled with quotes from my parents claiming I had betrayed family values, cut them off, and humiliated Emily in front of her boss. The words stung, but what hit harder was the comment section already filling with opinions from strangers. By the time I got home that evening, the story had spread to Facebook, where my mother's post was being shared faster than wildfire. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were tagging each other. Old neighbors chimed in about how they had always suspected trouble in the Irving family. It was messy, public, and exactly the kind of spectacle my parents thrived on. Marcus called that night. His voice was steady, but I could tell he was irritated. "Claire, I need to know if this is going to interfere with our expansion. Investors are asking questions." The board saw the article. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers to my temple. "I never wanted this, Marcus. I wanted a home, not a circus." "I know," he said quietly. "But we have to manage this. Silence can be dangerous when the other side is controlling the story." The next morning, I found a letter taped to my front door. Not an email, not a text, but an actual typed letter on thick paper. It was from my father's lawyer, demanding I attend a family arbitration meeting to resolve disputes in good faith. At the bottom was a threat that if I refused, they would pursue a full trial. I took the letter to Attorney Perez, who laughed bitterly. "They want to scare you," she said, sliding the paper back across her desk. "They have no case. But they will keep trying because this isn't about law, it's about control." She was right. A week later, they escalated. Emily showed up at the company office in tears, claiming I had targeted her career. A coworker texted me from the break room. "She's saying you and Marcus planned this to ruin her. HR is listening." I drove to the office that afternoon, heart pounding, and found Marcus waiting outside the conference room. Inside, Emily was red-eyed, her voice trembling just enough to sound pitiful. She accused me of manipulating Grandma, of selling the house out of spite of living upstairs, to torment her while she tried to work downstairs. When Marcus saw me, he gestured for me to sit. I did, keeping my voice calm. "This isn't about work," I said firmly. "This is about family resentment. My grandmother left me the house legally. I sold it legally. The fact that it now houses the marketing department is coincidence." Emily slammed her hand on the table. "Coincidence? You knew exactly what you were doing. You wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone." Marcus leaned forward. "Emily, enough. This is not a family tribunal, it is a workplace. And in this workplace, accusations without evidence are unacceptable." Her face crumpled, but I saw the flash of panic beneath the tears. HR dismissed her complaint within the week, citing lack of merit, but the damage was done. Word had spread through the company. Some sympathized with her, but more quietly admitted they were tired of the favoritism she had coasted on for years. The fallout hit my parents next. A neighbor recorded my mother screaming outside the house one Saturday morning, demanding I come out and face her. The video ended up on TikTok of all places with captions like "Entitled Parents Strike Again." Watching it made me laugh for the first time in weeks, though I quickly shut my laptop guilt-mixing with relief. But not all of it was funny. The scrutiny was intense. Strangers knew my name, my address, my family drama. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't anticipated. One evening, as I walked to my car, a woman I didn't know stopped me. "You're that girl," she said, the one who stood up to her parents. Her voice was soft, almost reverent. "Good for you. Don't let them bully you." Her words settled deep in me. Maybe this mess wasn't just mine anymore. Maybe it resonated with people because they had lived versions of it too. Still, the war wasn't over. At the end of the month, I received another notice. My parents had filed a second petition this time, claiming Grandma had been unduly influenced by promises of financial gain. It was flimsy, Perez assured me, but it meant another round of legal paperwork, another hearing, another public spectacle. That night I sat in Grandma's old armchair, the one by the window where she used to drink her tea, and stared out at the quiet street. For every step forward, my parents seemed determined to drag me back. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't the same girl they used to control. I had allies now. I had the law on my side. And I had a calm that came from finally standing in my own truth. The phone buzzed on the table beside me. A message from Marcus. "We may need to make a public statement. Call me tomorrow." I stared at the screen, my pulse steady. If they wanted this war to be public, then public was exactly what they were going to get. Marcus's office felt colder than usual when I stepped inside the next morning. The blinds were half-drawn sunlight cutting sharp lines across the conference table. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We have to take control of the story, Claire, or they will keep shaping it. The investors want stability, not scandal." I folded my hands in my lap, steadying myself. "What are you suggesting, a press statement?" he replied, measured and calm. "Not defensive. Just facts. That the property was purchased legally, that you are a tenant under a formal lease, and that the company is moving forward with its expansion. Nothing about your family drama, only the truth that concerns the business." My chest tightened. "Once it's out there forever." "It's already out there," Marcus said gently. "At least this way the record is clear." I nodded slowly. He was right. It wasn't about hiding anymore. It was about claiming the narrative. That afternoon, the statement went live. Within hours, local news stations picked it up, this time with Marcus's name front and center. The spin shifted. Suddenly, the story wasn't about an ungrateful daughter, but about a tech CEO investing in the community. My name was mentioned, yes, but as a footnote. A legal tenant. The whispers that had haunted me were replaced with headlines about innovation and new jobs. Emily was furious. She cornered me in the parking lot 2 days later, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You think you're clever, don't you? Making me look like a fool in front of everyone." I leaned against my car, arms crossed. "I didn't have to make you look like anything, Emily. You did that yourself." Her face twisted, the tears starting again. "He's watching me every day now. Every mistake, every hesitation. Do you know what that feels like?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I've known that feeling my entire life." She flinched as if I had struck her. For once, she had no comeback. She walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement, the sound more fragile than powerful. The legal battle dragged on, but Perez dismantled their arguments piece by piece. At the preliminary hearing, the judge's tone was clipped. "Mr. and Mrs. Baker, your claims of undue influence are unsupported. Unless you bring new evidence, this case has no merit." I sat there in the courtroom, hands folded in my lap, listening as my parents sputtered. My mother's voice wavered as she insisted I had turned Grandma against them. My father's face grew red as he shouted about fairness. The judge remained unmoved. Case dismissed, she ruled her gavel sharp against the wood. Outside, the courthouse reporters gathered. Microphones thrust toward me, questions flying. Did you betray your parents? Did you sell the house to ruin your sister? I took a deep breath, remembering Marcus's words. Control the story, I spoke calmly. My grandmother left me her house in a valid will. I sold it legally. The rest is family business, and family business is not for public consumption. The clip aired on the evening news. Neighbors texted me that night, saying I looked composed, strong. Even strangers online began calling me brave. The tide was turning. But inside I was exhausted. Nights stretched, long as I sat in Grandma's armchair, reading her old letters, trying to remind myself why I had fought this hard. She had written once, "Stand tall even when they try to cut you down. Roots that run deep cannot be uprooted by storms." Those words became my anchor. The next blow didn't come from the courthouse. It came from Emily's job. A week after the hearing, whispers floated through the company halls. She was on probation. Performance issues, missed deadlines, lack of focus. Marcus confirmed it later over the phone. I gave her every chance, Claire. But charm doesn't write campaigns, and pity doesn't land clients. Hearing it should have brought satisfaction. Instead, I felt a hollow ache. I didn't want her life ruined. I only wanted mine respected. Then, the final humiliation came. My parents hosted a family gathering, one of those reunions they loved to orchestrate, inviting every cousin, aunt, and distant relative who would listen. But instead of sympathy, they found questions. The younger cousins wanted to know why they had tried to take my inheritance. One uncle openly said, "Sounds like Claire finally stood her ground." The story had flipped completely, and they couldn't control it anymore. One evening, as I walked past the garden, I saw Mrs. Henderson on her porch. She raised her glass of iced tea toward me. "You did it, Claire. You broke free." I smiled faintly, though my heart still carried the weight of the battles fought. Yes, I thought, but the war had left scars. Later that night, Emily's text came. Short, bitter, and sharp. "You win. Hope it was worth it." I set the phone down, staring out the window at the fading light over the garden. The quiet pressed in, heavy but steady. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for their next move. I wasn't scrambling to defend myself. I was simply here, in my own home, holding ground they could no longer touch. Spring came early that year, and with it a kind of peace I had not known since childhood. The garden bloomed in colors that felt almost defiant, roses, pushing up strong and unapologetic tulips, standing proud after a long winter. Every morning, I carried my coffee to the porch, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood, and realized that I no longer woke up waiting for the next fight. Emily had left the company a month earlier. Her departure was quiet, almost hidden, a short announcement buried in the weekly newsletter. Rumor had it she tried to spin it as a personal choice, but everyone knew the truth. She had been given chances, and she let them slip away. For once, her tears and theatrics had not saved her. My parents retreated too. After the last family gathering turned against them, they stopped posting their long tirades online. I heard through a cousin that they were thinking about moving to Arizona, starting over somewhere people did not know their story. I did not feel triumph when I heard it. Only relief. The noise had finally dulled. The house itself had transformed. Downstairs, Marcus's team had moved to a commercial space just as he promised, leaving the rooms quiet again. The office furniture was gone, replaced with sunlight and the echo of my grandmother's presence. Upstairs remained my sanctuary, filled with books, the smell of fresh flowers, and the rhythm of a life I was finally building on my terms. One Saturday afternoon, Marcus stopped by to check on the property. He leaned against the porch rail, surveying the garden with an approving nod. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said. "You protected what she left you." I looked around at the blooms swaying in the breeze at the porch where she and I had sat together so many summers. "I think she knew this would happen," I said softly. "She prepared me for it." Marcus smiled, but it was a quiet one, the kind that carried understanding. He left soon after, giving me the space he knew I valued. That night, as I cleaned out an old box in the attic, I found another envelope addressed in Grandma's handwriting. Inside was a letter I had never seen. "My dearest Claire," it read, "you will face storms, and they will try to strip you of what is yours. But remember, strength is not in shouting louder. It is in standing firm when the world tries to push you down. Take what I have left you, not just the house, but the lesson. You do not have to give away pieces of yourself to be loved. You are enough." I cried then, not from grief but from gratitude. Her words reached across time, steadying me in a way no court ruling or public statement ever could. The neighbors often stopped to chat now, no longer curious onlookers but friends. Mrs. Henderson brought over pies. Mr. Lewis down the street offered to help mend the fence. Even strangers had written me letters, women who had faced the same battles of favoritism and manipulation, thanking me for standing up. It was humbling to realize how many people carried similar scars. I had worried that I would feel empty without the constant drama, that quiet would somehow feel hollow. But it didn't. Quiet felt like freedom. Quiet felt like breathing again, after years of holding my lungs tight. On the anniversary of Grandma's passing, I invited a few close friends over for dinner. We sat on the porch under strings of lights, sharing food and laughter, the garden blooming around us. At one point, I caught myself smiling so wide my cheeks hurt. For the first time, I was not waiting for my family's approval or fearing their disapproval. I was simply living. When I lay down that night, the house was still and warm, holding me the way it once held her. I closed my eyes, knowing that my parents' threats no longer reached me. Emily's jealousy no longer weighed on me, and my grandmother's gift had become exactly what she wanted, it to be a foundation for a life built with strength, dignity. If you have ever had to stand up to family pressure, if you have had to fight for what was rightfully yours, then you know how heavy it can feel. But you also know the lightness that comes when you finally choose yourself. I would love to hear your thoughts, your own stories, or even the battles you are still fighting. If this journey resonated with you, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Your support means more than you know, and it reminds me and so many others that none of us are truly alone.